Right now, the United States is on the edge of war with two tyrants. As reports coming in about the Chinese possibly invading Taiwan and our president saying we would have military action in response, it's present in my mind, at least, the result of tyranny, and that's always death. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I'm your host, Peter, and I have with me my brother right here.
Hey, I'm JP.
We got JP in the house. All right, well, welcome back. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we're discussing something that we're seeing kind of a lot of examples of in the modern world, I would say. We're seeing a lot of tyranny and tyrants, and it's rampant in all different kinds of cultures, from North Korea to China to even the United States. We're seeing different forms of tyranny. So we wanted today to take kind of a look back at history and see tyrants through the ages and kind of look at what things they have in common, what kind of ways that they manipulated culture or used culture and used tradition or breaking away from tradition in order to assert their dominance on a society. And you see a lot of examples of this.
Why did you choose this topic? What's important about this topic right now?
Well, there are many things that make it very relevant. I think, of course, an easy example right now is that right now the United States is possibly, it's on the edge of war with two tyrants right now. We're on the edge of war with a tyrant in Russia, as well as a tyrant in China. And as reports coming in about the Chinese possibly invading Taiwan and our president saying that we would have military action in response, I think it's present in my mind, at least, the result of tyranny, and that's always death. As many of you know, I'm in the military. So if we go to war with China, in my mind, at least, that is, it's more likely, and personally, I think it's more likely that I would die than not. So these are very present realities, at least to me, and I think to many of us. So it's very scary, but it's, I think, something that we should kind of just have an awareness of and to have a little bit of an understanding, so that we're not just that cog in the wheel that's following along, or that's part of this greater system of tyranny that we don't actually want to be a part of. Does that make any sense?
That makes a lot of sense. It is scary. It's a scary time, and I would add to that besides the fact that we might go to war with two tyrants at any moment now, it seems like the United States is ripe for tyranny as well.
Absolutely. Tyranny, I think, always comes at a time when whatever nation that ends up getting taken over by a tyrant that nation is at a great crossroads, or at a great time where it's not sure exactly of its own identity. So you have our first people that we'll discuss is Caesar and Caesar Augustus. And it was a time in the Republic when the Roman Republic was teetering and democracy was kind of eclipsing. So it was kind of a time where there was great confusion, great chaos, great corruption. And then this figure emerges as kind of the savior, but in the process destroying the institution that he's supposedly going to save. So I think you definitely do see that in the United States as well. And it's really scary, just kind of looking at things that have happened in the past couple of years, and just the way that mandates come down and society closing down from top to bottom. It's really true. It's also present in the United States, not just China, not just Russia.
Yeah. Well, where does the word tyrant come from? Take us back into the etymology of it.
Well, you'll have to excuse me with a topic like this. I'm gonna be drinking a little bit. Got to pour myself some right here. So, it's interesting to note that the word I think we use the word tyrant and dictator pretty synonymously in our culture. But the words tyrant and dictator didn't originally have the negative connotation that we have with them associated with it today. It kind of comes from Roman words in Roman times, when oftentimes when the Roman state, the Roman Republic, was in dire need and great trouble. Under normal circumstances, the Roman Republic is run by the Senate of Rome, kind of what our modern day Senate and House of Representatives is modeled on. They would run it in conjunction with a number of different magistrates, and the most powerful of those magistrates being the consuls. There were 2 consuls. Romans, from their very foundation, hated the concept of kings. They hated it so much that even when throughout the hundreds of years of the empire, no emperor, no matter how maniacal or power hungry he was, ever called himself a king, because he knew that if he ever did, the Roman people would uprise and just throw him out, because that they could apparently tolerate a super tyrannical emperor, but the moment he calls himself a king, it's like, nope, that's too far. So there was this ingrained into the Roman identity, this idea that we are the senatus populusque Romanos, the Senate and people of Rome. But sometimes when they also realized that one person in charge can get a lot more done than 2 people or than an entire Senate, because with a Senate you have deliberation, and even with just the 2 consuls, you have disagreements, and that slows the process down. So when, let's say, Hannibal is knocking on the doors of Rome, or some great threat from without comes in, they would elect a leader, and this would be the dictator. He's called the dictator. And he would have the power given, he would have all power given to him in the Roman Republic. And he controlled everything, but it was for a very short time span. I don't remember the exact days of that. I think it was about a month that he had in order to get things back into repair. And so for many, like hundreds of years, this was a practice that was very common in Rome. When emergency arose, they would choose a dictator who would take over for a very short period of time, and then he was expected after that to give up his power and return it to the people and Senate of Rome. And so this negative idea of a dictator didn't actually come till later on, as we'll see, when we have dictators who give themselves the reputation of being very negative. So I don't know. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I don't remember exactly what the term translates into in English, but dictator is supposed to, if you just take the different prefix and add the root of the word, you get one man's strength or one man's power. It goes to show the idea for the word was, we need a sort of hero here. Like, we need something to, I say that and I think of Arrested Development and Buster Bluth saying, they're putting me in something called Hero Squad.
Hero Squad. I'm going to army school, mother.
Yeah, that's it. So Buster Bluth aside, I think what the image of that the word is supposed to convey is desperate times call for desperate measures. However, when times get bad, that's what makes great men. That's what makes great individuals who can rise, not just men, of course, men and women, who can rise to the occasion and handle the situation for the polis, for the polity. So I think, I guess the big thing that I have to say is, if that's how the word started out, how do we get to the point where the word dictator means what it means to us, and tyranny means what it means to us?
Hmm. Well, I mean, I think you get a couple of thousand years of bad dictators and misuse of power, and you're very quickly going to get a very negative connotation with it. I think I'm not sure exactly at what point. I'm not remembering right now at what point the that term came to be seen as such a negative in such a negative light. Although
Well,
really,
I do know
uh,
that someone, an early person that used the term in a negative way was Aristotle. Aristotle used the word dictator as the negative side of monarchy. He saw that a good ruling nation that had the rule of one, and he wasn't saying that that's the only way that a nation could be ruled well, but he was saying a well-ruled nation with only one person ruling it would be a monarchy. And then a nation with one person ruling it who's doing it badly would call it a dictator. So his sense, the Greek sense, was different than the Roman sense in that regard for what is good and what is bad. And it just seems like Aristotle's thought has been borne out by a whole series of the past 2,000 years of brutal dictators that have not ruled well at all. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, I mean it's really hard because obviously I think we as Americans have an especially kind of negative connotation with the word dictator. I think you get a little bit less of that in Europe because it's ingrained into our very essence as Americans to not like kings, kind of very similar to the Romans, to not like kings and to not like this this idea of oppression. Because if you think about it, I mean, it's one of the reasons why I always say like the United States is the best country in the world, because we were born out of this idea of outcasting the oppressor, and throwing off this mantle of oppression and this idea of freedom. And so, yeah, I'm not sure exactly when it was, but you get it for very good reason too, I think, because as we'll see, the results of these dictators throughout the thousands of years has been millions and millions of human deaths. But it's interesting because I'm not so quick. Our first subject here, Caesar and Caesar Augustus, I would not sure that I would call them bad dictators or really tyrants in the way that we think of it today. They definitely concentrated all power to themselves and kind of sapped away the power of the Senate and of democracy, which if someone tried to do that today in the United States, which some would say some people are, I would really want to fight that. I would fight that really hard. But obviously it's a very different world in the pre-AD Roman world. And this is a time, as I was saying, where the Republic is kind of in shambles. There's a lot of civil war going on. And you have Caesar, who he kind of takes on the mantle of protector of the Republic. He kind of assumes this identity of restoring Roman ideals and Roman virtue. And he has, even as he becomes Caesar, as we always, even today, we know the term Caesar is like basically synonymous with the word emperor. As that, he still has competition. He still has people who disagree with him very vocally in the Senate. It's people like Cicero. And eventually, as we know, he is assassinated by the Senate. It's kind of funny. I don't think that any of our senators today would have, I don't know if I'd call it guts or just the will to actually go and physically be the ones to stab the dictator. But that's what they did. The Roman senators converged on Caesar and physically killed him. They didn't hire hitmen to do it. They did it themselves. But then you have his, a number of years down the road, you have Caesar's nephew, Octavian Caesar, who goes on to become Caesar Augustus, who assumes the mantle of his adopted father. And with the very similar ideas of being the defender of the Republic, and the restorer of Roman virtues, he also becomes a dictator after his adopted father. But he ends up accomplishing more than Caesar ever did or could have, because I think, like, from what I've read, I don't know if you have a different opinion, I think that Caesar Augustus, Octavian, was very legitimate in what he wanted to do. I don't think it was just him grabbing at power. I think that he legitimately did want to restore Roman society, because he was very traditional just in his entire life. It wasn't just a facade. His family life and all his writings were just very preoccupied with restoring Roman traditional values, especially the family. He was very big on restoring this idea of the Roman family, which Rome was founded on, right? That's one of the big differences between Rome and Greece in my mind. I really don't like Greece. I think Greece was really perverted, honestly, in a lot of ways. But I always really did love how Rome was, it's pretty much its founding principle was the family. And Caesar Augustus kind of wanted to restore that. In the process, he did become a dictator, and he pretty much sapped away all the power of the Senate, or set it up so that down the road, through the centuries afterwards, the Senate would lose all its power. But that's what we're looking at right now. And he even built a whole mythos, like we've talked about myths in the past. He had one of the great Roman writers, Virgil, write a great myth for him, as his founding story. That's the Aeneid, which is a fascinating book. I like it even more than the Odyssey or those works by Homer.
But he incorporated those works.
Right. So it's really fun. It's kind of like Marvel today, where it's like they create the big cinematic universe. It was Virgil adding to the cinematic universe of Homer. Right. He's like, I'm going to add on to this and make it more Roman and bigger.
It's brilliant.
Yeah. So it's a lot of fun. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I have so many. First one, I want to defend Greece a little bit. When you said, I'm not a big fan of Greece, I immediately it popped into my mind, Socrates being forced to drink the hemlock, in effect being murdered, or a political move to remove someone who's a thorn in the government's side, because he's spoken too much truth. He's made too many good points, and the ruling men cannot allow him to continue to do what he does. And his great pupil Plato once asks, what would your apology be if you were in this position? Because before Socrates died, he wrote an apologia, where he basically said, sorry, not sorry, for all the things that he did, and explained why he said all the things that he said, which he's now being killed for. And apply that to now. We have plenty of people in the here and now in our America that are speaking inconvenient truths, are speaking using the best of their capabilities, the reason and logic that are at our disposal. And for that, there are factions of our country, sides of our country, that would like nothing better than to make these people drink hemlock, because they're being way too inconvenient. So fast forward maybe 3,000, 4,000 years, and look back on this moment in time, I think it'd be very easy to say, especially if things start to go bad these next few decades, from bad to worse, let's say, I think it'd be very easy to say, I don't like the United States of America. And you ignore all of the amazing things that we've done and that we've stood for, because there's those people that They want you to drink the hemlock because they don't want to listen to the truth anymore. They can't stand it. So my apologia for Greece is that there was a lot of good as well as a lot of bad. And we have much to be grateful for people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who handed down these thoughts to us that we build upon now. We didn't earn half of what we use now to get through our life. We didn't earn 99.9% of what we use to get through our life now, to even think or imagine. So a brief apologia for Greece. And then the other thing that I wanted to say is jumping to the image that you created of our senators. Would they be, in effect, man enough to assassinate a tyrant? That's actually one of the things I think people forget about Trump. And hear me out, because this sounds a little weird, but in past ages, not so distant past, our politicians were not the type of people that you think of now when you think of a U.S. politician. For example, I'm guessing most of our viewers haven't heard of the caning of Sumter, where a senator got so mad at an argument that another senator made on the floor of the Senate, he went to his desk with a cane and started beating him, trying to kill the guy on the floor of the Senate. And the other senator, Sumter, he couldn't get out from around his desk, which was nailed to the floor. And so he ripped it out of the ground and threw it at the guy that was attacking him in order to stop the caning. This is our history. This is the people that have been our elected officials in the not so distant past were violent men, and now we have violent men and women, I'm sure, that are there. We are not so civilized as we'd like ourselves to think. And in a way, I actually admire that someone would be that honest about the fact that we're not civilized. I would prefer the outward attacks as opposed to the tweets and the Instagrams and TikTok rants and attacks. I think it would be much more efficacious to just pick up your cane and say, I don't like what you're saying. Have at thee, villain. And I think Trump is a sign of that outward aggression that's coming back in our politics, where Trump would just stand there. And it's something that I really admire. He would just stand there in front of all the reporters and they would spew venom upon him and he would take it and fight back. It's impressive. Biden, I do not think Biden would be able to take even a tiny percentage of the venom. Like how many days, how many weeks, how many months has it been since his last press conference? And has he ever had a press conference which wasn't prepared questions from prepared lists of reporters? I don't think so. So anyway, that's another bit of a rant about how Trump is a sign of our distant past coming around again. And I think it's a lot more honest of a past. So I don't think it's completely beyond the pale that a group of U.S. senators decide to assassinate a dictator should a dictator take control of the United States, which I hope doesn't happen. And so I hope that no assassinations happen. And even if a dictator does take control, I'm not saying that assassination is warranted, which I actually don't think an assassination on Caesar was warranted. Like you were saying, Caesar and Caesar Augustus were both complicated individuals who did a lot of good as well as some harm. I don't know what outweighs. I'm not sure if the good outweighed the harm or vice versa. So just jumping back to, I think, the main point that you had, which was Caesar Augustus did a lot of good things. Absolutely, he did. He did a lot of bad things too. I have a hard time getting around the fact that he assassinated Caesar's, or it wasn't even an assassination, it was just a straight up execution. He executed Caesar's son with Cleopatra, Caesarion. which he was 14. It's kind of a rough deal. And the only reason he executed him was because he was Caesar's son. And that was a threat to him. So I think there's a lot of good along with the bad, and Caesar Augustus definitely did much of both. I can't say what outweighs the other.
Yeah, and I think honestly, this is what makes good stories.
Absolutely.
Why
That's
history is full of such good stories, because people are not one-dimensional. They are three-dimensional human beings. They're not completely evil and they're not completely good. Even to fast forward a couple hundred years, maybe a few hundred years to Constantine, which a lot of Christians know about Constantine because he legalized the practice of Christianity in the Roman Empire. But Constantine, he had his wife executed and he had his son executed. He was, and now but he's still, for some reasons, kind of revered by many people. So he had a lot of good and he had a lot of bad. So these people are three-dimensional. As with the years go on, I think it becomes much more clear with tyrants that their ideas are infectious. Like, I think it's kind of it's a little bit of a interesting line to see the difference between, because you have Caesar and Caesar Augustus who were tyrants, who were dictators, who were destructive to democracy, but their ideas were founded on good principles, I would say, for the most part. But by the time you get to obviously Hitler or the more modern tyrants, their ideas are not founded on any kind of good idea. There are poisonous ideas that are anti-human and therefore resulted in such utter destruction. So it's interesting to see at the beginning here where, albeit it is destructive to democracy, which in my mind is not a good thing, you have that kind of positive aspect as well. So it's just super fascinating. And you were talking about kind of today how we see that idea of kind of rejecting all kind of thought in many ways, and that the rejection of reality reminded me of how old Jordan Peterson has gotten into deep water with just saying that there's an objective standard for beauty, and it's not good for a person to be super unhealthy and out of shape. Like, you're not diminishing the value of that person, but holding that up as a standard is not healthy for society because it's harmful to society. It's not healthy to be unhealthy. And just for saying that, people go crazy on Twitter and pile on top of him because he is just saying truth, which is not as unacceptable to our kind of tyrannically minded society.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon that what I was saying about Trump that I admired is that he stood face to face in front of a room full of reporters who hated him and spit every type of venom they could think of upon him. And he took it and fought back. It's not the same on Twitter. You say something and people spew venom from every corner of the globe, but they're not doing it to your face. It's easier. It's harder to do it when you're face to face with someone and you realize this is a person whose idea that I'm going to take and I'm going to spit upon. So it's an interesting time. We've never dealt with something quite like this. I don't know what to make of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a good way of being able to see the future is by looking into the past. So let's look at some other dictators, shall we?
Let's do it.
Let's look at this is obviously centuries and centuries down the road, much later on, after medieval Europe has developed and the colonial world has developed as well. We have Napoleon, who is also a very fascinating character. All of these characters, like, I've really read a lot about, and they've always really been interesting to me. That shouldn't be taken to say that I like dictators, because I hate dictators, but Napoleon was also an interesting guy. He became the dictator of France when he wasn't actually even from France, or wasn't really even French.
Corsican.
He was Corsican, from the island of Corsica in the Mediterranean Sea. And
here's your segue, though. He took the name of First Consul when he took power, harkening back to Rome.
Yeah, which is always the thing that I really enjoy, because no matter what, in Western society, when you want to be great, when you want to hearken to some kind of idea of greatness and grandeur, you always go back to the Romans, which is a lot of fun, very fascinating. But he took, similar to how Caesar and Caesar Augustus did it, he arose during a time of great tumult and great chaos, because we had the absolute monarchs in France for a while. And in response to that, the brutal French Revolution arises and just sends France into an absolute chaos, complete anarchy, blood like literally flowing through the streets, heads rolling around everywhere in the city of Paris. And
if you think, just to clear the air, if you think that was a democracy, just so people understand, that was democratic voting that led to that type of bloodthirsty. So if you think that one brutal despot can do a lot of damage, just imagine a few thousand or that would be an oligarchy. Imagine a few million, what they would do. It's not pretty. That's what the French Revolution was.
Right. So the French Revolution, like, we do have kind of a little bit of a positive idea of revolutions in the United States because of our American Revolution, which was a very good thing. But the French Revolution should not be mistaken or confused at all with the American Revolution, because it was an entirely different kind of revolution in its very essence.
Spoken like a true American.
Well, I mean, I think that the death count will reveal that. Will testify to that on its own. And this is where we get the guillotine, obviously, because
guillotine.
The French kind of mastered at this time, just because they wanted a faster way of killing people. So what better way than to just set up this little contraption here where you just toss a person on there, chop off their head, push them over, and then chop the next person off.
Rivaling the Aztecs for efficiency.
Right. And kind of similar, to Aztec Mexico, you had blood flowing through the streets. This is the kind of history I don't think that people really get taught or told about. It's crazy for me whenever people say they don't like history, which I assume everyone that I talk to doesn't like history. I just assume that they don't like it, because what we teach in school, from my understanding, luckily I was never taught in this way, but what most people's experience is basically a set of dates and
sterilized,
and just random, fun facts that have no bearing on reality or your life, or no interest in any way. In reality, history is rivers of blood flowing through the streets, and
no black and white characters.
Right, incredible stories. Super fascinating.
Everyone a different shade of gray.
All right, but Napoleon was basically growing up during this time. He didn't have to deal with most of the chaos because he was in the Mediterranean Sea, on a little island there. But he rose, and when he was becoming a young man, France took over Corsica, and he entered the military school in France and went to mainland Europe, and kind of rose in the ranks. And he was always an interesting person because he was an outcast. He wasn't considered French by the other, military officers, and he was kind of shunned for that. And he was a small person and very disagreeable. But
Health
somehow,
troubles up the wazoo.
all right, he was also very assertive, and he kind of rose to the ranks and very quickly kind of became this force to be reckoned with, a very powerful figure, eventually becoming the emperor of Rome. I mean, not Rome, of France, but taking after the emperor of Rome, of course.
And that was a title he craved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he sought after it. But he had this very similar idea of Caesar and Caesar Augustus of being the protector of the revolution, which is just crazy because here he is becoming a more absolute monarch than the absolute monarchs of France, and that the revolution started over. But he kind of creates a similar mythos as Caesar Augustus did, as being this great defender of democracy and this great protector of the republic. And with this newfound power in France, he spreads throughout Europe, going as far as Russia, and dwarfing all of the powers of that time, and threatening Great Britain even. And so it just becomes, it's very, I would kind of say this kind of is World War I. We call World War I in the early 1900s World War I, but this is kind of also in its way, in some ways, a world war as well.
Because he fought in Egypt, he fought in the Americas, he fought all over.
Mm-hmm. You have Mexico. A lot of history in Mexico is affected by Napoleon. We have
our sister dances in Emperor Maximilian's palace, and Emperor Maximilian was set up by Napoleon Bonaparte.
And we just had Annie on our show last episode that we did, and Annie, she was proposed to at the castle of El Castillo de Chapultepec, which was Maximilian's castle over in Mexico City. So all the connections are very fascinating. We also have some crazy stories that they always left a big impression on my mind of when Napoleon invaded Spain, because Napoleon invaded and took over Spain. And the government of Spain, as we know at that time, was basically crumbling, had no real power, pretty much. And so it was the people of Spain that resisted. And
fought him roof to roof and home to home.
Napoleon had to fight block for block in each city against the Spaniards, who refused to give up without laying down their lives for their homes. And so, like you were saying, it's literally roof to roof fighting, where they would, they'd be killed in one block, and then they would move on to the next block. And ultimately, Napoleon just kind of pushed on through, but not without great resistance and casualties. So, of course, then another just fascinating story there.
Fascinating.
Yeah. All right. What have you? Are you familiar with any of the stories about Napoleon, or was it?
Well, I think that everyone has heard some sort of Napoleon story. I think what is most fascinating to me about him is how we look at him with such rose-colored glasses.
I think what most people know about Napoleon is that he would have his hand in his coat. He's always portrayed with his hand in his pocket for some reason. Yeah, kind of creepy.
Well, I've heard it was because he had a gut indigestion. So he always had troubles with his stomach, and so he was always holding his stomach in pain. And so that's how he would pose. That's what I've heard. It could just be an urban legend, though. One point that I'd love to make, though, because it's such a common misconception, is that Napoleon was a defender of the Catholic Church. And in a way, he was not as bad as the French Terror, the Reign of Terror, just like the French Reign of Terror was terrible to everybody. It's called the French Reign of Terror for a reason. Well, they also really hated the Catholic Church, and they executed pretty much any priest that they could find or any practicing Catholic that they could find. Napoleon didn't do that. However, Napoleon was no friend of the church. Napoleon also was, you alluded to it earlier, and I brought it up as well. He wanted to be the emperor of Rome. He saw himself as Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor. And he expected the Pope to treat him as if he was basically the leader of the church, because he saw himself as the defender of the church. And the Pope didn't see him as the leader of the church because, well, rightfully the Pope is, especially for us Catholics who believe in the primacy of Peter and of the chair of St. Peter. So he actually imprisoned the Pope. It was a constant battle between the two. I don't believe he ever killed the Pope, but it was never a good relationship. And it increasingly got worse and worse. The only thing that happened with Napoleon is that he managed to get everyone else angry at him as well. He, just like another dictator that we're going to talk about very soon, decided to pick a fight with the whole world. And he was so brilliant that he almost won. He was far more brilliant than other dictators that we're going to speak about later on. But he was still a brutal madman of a dictator who desired far more than what was healthy or good. I think something that Caesar had that might have saved him is he had a real emergency in front of him, that the Roman Republic was crumbling before his eyes. And the Roman Republic was already massive. So he already had a responsibility to this massive empire, which I think clouded any other type of ambitions that could have sprung up. Napoleon didn't inherit a massive empire. France was a strong country. Obviously, it was strong because he wouldn't have been able to invade the entire world after taking control of France. But it still was not the whole world. It was not the Roman Emperor. It was France. It was a tiny fraction of Europe, then Christendom, and nowhere near like a world power that Rome was. So he didn't have that same weight of responsibility that Caesar carried upon his shoulders as the dictator of Rome. And that, I think, is something that drove Napoleon a little bit further than any dictator that came before him, is because he had the same weight of ambition. He wanted to rule the world. He wanted to be that type of person. And that is a mad desire. So I think he is definitely on the side of, I could, at least with my hindsight, which is maybe not quite 2020, but a little bit better than my foresight, I would put him a little bit more on the bad scale than the good. How about you?
Yeah, I would say so as well. I mean, he definitely, as you said, was not a friend of the church. I think that he saw the church as a tool, as something that he wanted to use to his advantage. Because the people, you had the radical Enlightenment atheists, like in Paris and in certain parts of France, who were really fueling the French Revolution. But really the average person in all other parts of France they were still deeply Catholic. It was still a very deeply Catholic country to its very core. Concurrently with the French Revolution and Napoleon is Saint John Vianney, which is a beloved saint in the Catholic Church, the patron saint of parish priests, I believe, who was a very simple and simple-minded man, no great theologian, but just a great pastor, a person who loved his flock. And this he kind of, in my mind, kind of embodies the spirit of France, of the Frenchmen at that time. And so to Napoleon, that was something to be manipulated and to be used for his own gain and for his own power. So no, I don't think that he had the best interests of France or the French people in mind at all. And I do think that Caesar and Caesar Augustus both legitimately had the best interests of the Roman people in their minds.
It's a great distinction. And I want to drive that home a little bit more because I hadn't thought of it that way before. But you mentioned how St. John Vianney embodies the virtue of an average Frenchman of the time, not a noble, not an elite, but just the average Frenchman, right? Did I get that right? Okay. That is something that we as Americans probably will just dismiss. The French, come on, it's French, that sort of thing. But we, at least as Catholics, probably respect G.K. Chesterton. And Chesterton would write an example, for example, the Napoleon of Notting Hill, one of his great, and other works as well, but one of his great solaces was the virtue of just an ordinary Frenchman. This stands for something that is actually quite important. The virtue of an ordinary Frenchman has gone down in literature and has gone down in history as something that is quite special, is quite unique. And as Americans, we don't really understand that. And as an American, I can't quite put my finger on it, but I can point out to the fact that this is something that is worthy of respect because it has transformed our reality. It influenced our now. That past influenced our now to a way that we cannot fully appreciate, but it did. It's there. We can see the effects of what that ordinary Frenchman has done and how the ordinary Frenchman helped bring the faith to the Americas. How the ordinary Frenchman upheld, the ordinary Frenchman is what made Charlemagne. He upheld the church. Because as the church was in crisis and danger of being overrun during the dark Middle Ages. And it led to the high Middle Ages. So it's an important point. And you made it, and I had not thought of it that before now. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and talking about Charlemagne, I think some might point to him because he was a Holy Roman Emperor. So as an emperor, you might say that he could be seen as a dictator, and that would be a great misunderstanding of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, Germanic Frenchman, Frank, was he kind of restored many aspects of the Roman Empire, but with the central tenet of that empire being Catholicism and being Christianity. And so obviously if there's a big, huge difference for him, and I would never say he was a dictator because he had a great council of people and he set up an empire that was in many ways a democracy throughout the ages in Europe, right. Holy Roman Empire. Which Napoleon himself also wanted to see himself as, like you were saying.
Yeah, and I think that's an important key that, and I know we want to get to another dictator, but just to make that distinction that a king is only a king if he has some sort of check, some sort of balance. For example, the Spanish kings that we spoke about, the one as Spain was crumbling, the Spanish kings had that check, the Cortes, the ruling of the elders in each city that were elected by the people of each city. He had to go to each Cortes and get their approval in order to raise taxes, for example. And Charlemagne also had that check. So I think the checks can be different, but as long as there is one, then that is what separates you from a dictator or a tyrant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Shall we move on to a more modern dictator?
Well, I mean, I think the next one on our list is one that hopefully everyone knows a lot about, and that's Hitler. And Hitler, obviously brought on incredible destruction and mass violence and evil onto the world, very much coloring the entire 20th century for the whole world, not just for Europe. But Hitler's idea, I think we talked about Caesar and Caesar Augustus and Napoleon as they portraying themselves as the protector of the revolution, or the protector of the republic, the protector of the people and of democracy. Hitler was not concerned about the nation, the people of the nation of Germany. He was concerned exclusively for a subset of the German nation, of the German people, the Aryan race, which, you know, it's debatable if even they are technically Aryan. But he had this idea, and I think this really drove his tyranny and his form of dictatorship, was the idea of the master race, the Germanic people, the Aryans, as being superior to all other types of people. And of course, we know about the Holocaust against the Jews, as he had a particular vehemence against the Jews. But he also hated all other races. He hated Black people, and he hated religion. He hated all these different, anything that was not this supposed master Aryan race. And we had World War II because of it. So this is a dictator which we know a lot about because of his great impact that has affected, you know, we have grandfathers who fought in World War II. And I think that there aren't too many of these World War II vets left, but there's still a couple. And we still know, you know, many stories. But it took incredible bravery and incredible sacrifice in order to overthrow this man who arose during another period of great tumult and great confusion, because Germany was in chaos and was in shambles after World War I, due in many ways to the greed and the vindictiveness,
and our foolishness too,
of the allies, of countries like Britain and France, and the ignorance of the United States.
Hubris. Well, I think this is the easiest one to say. It's hard to find too much gray in Hitler. I think the only gray that I can find really is how he wanted to be an artist. And we've brought this up in podcasts in the past. If he had only managed to be a successful artist in Vienna, I think all of this might have at least not gone quite as bad as it did, because he would have been too busy to be a brutal dictator and take on the whole world and almost win. What were you going to say?
You know, a counter thought to that, though, is obviously Hitler was a great, not a great in any way, but a big figure who arose at the helm of this very racist kind of view of the world. But let's say that he did become a successful artist and ended up being happy in Austria, in Vienna, as a, you know, obscure or maybe well-known artist. Would World War II still have happened? Would some other person would they have come to the helm and kind of taken on the mantle of a big racist leader,
right,
who is kind of sapping, you know, taking advantage of the chaos of Germany at that time and playing towards the racism of Germany?
Yeah, I've made this argument actually that you brought up, that you're bringing up right now, in a massive script, the longest script I've ever wrote. Basically, the argument is it's baked into the cake already. There's some sort of person, a figurehead, that assumes the mantle of all this momentum that's growing, but it's going to happen anyway. So there's no reason to assassinate Hitler, because the things that brought Hitler that allowed him to do the Hitlerian things that we now know as Hitlerian, that force is still out there. It's not just Hitler, it's whatever made Hitler Hitler. That country of Germany had an evil that was festering, and it was allowed to take shape in Hitler, but it probably could have taken shape in anyone else that was angry enough to be it. I guess the one response I would make to that argument was, it doesn't take into account any actual abilities that Hitler had. He might have actually been really good at fighting or leading forces or being an organizer, because he was able to do something pretty incredible, which is almost defeat the entire world. Most people are not able to do something like that, at least the people that I know.
Well, I think a counterpoint to that would be that Germany had almost defeated the world just a few years ago before in World War I. I think that kind of says, in my mind, says a little bit more to the people of Germany as being apparently really good fighters and very militarily savvy, because they almost single-handedly won two world wars.
And in the words of Bob Hope, during the Cold War, after World War II has been decided, when Russia started getting ahead of us in the space race, he said famously, "Russia's German scientists are doing better than our German scientists. We got to do something about that." So they were also really good at science as well.
Oh man, I didn't know that you'd said that. That's rough. We love you, NASA. It's all right. We ended up winning.
Hey, we caught up. Our German scientists started working harder.
We ended up winning. It's okay. Yeah. So, I mean, this is all things that we could go into more at another time. It is fascinating, but I think the lesson to be learned here, or something to be taken away, is that dictators do play to people's passions, and that's what like a dictatorship is, or a tyrant is built around. That oftentimes, I think a great motivating factor that dictators and tyrants will use is fear of the other, or fear of a disease, fear of some kind of other force that's going to destroy your life and destroy your way of living, destroy your family. And so I think something that's important for us today as modern Americans is to be able to recognize that when people are trying to manipulate you and use your fears in order to get something that they want, or to have some kind of power over you. Yeah. Because authority is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, like, our society is built around authority and authority figures. And so from a certain respect, I think that authority is necessary, but not at the expense of freedom and at the expense of free will. And so I think that as Americans, we need to really be on the lookout for whichever side it's coming from of the political world. When someone is playing to your passions and playing to your fears, those should be setting off alarms as something that is tyrannical and it is attempting to manipulate you.
I see that. I think my takeaway, I know we need to close, my takeaway is that the one pattern that we've seen in all these dictators, even from very, very dark gray dictators to maybe a little closer towards white sort of dictators, but the one pattern we've always seen is that they arise from chaos. And chaos always arises, at least according to the patterns we've seen through history, during an absence of virtue. So what we can do to fight a potential rise of a dictator here in our own country, in our beloved United States of America, in our beloved Texas, we can be more virtuous. I think if we focus on our own virtue and the virtue of within our families and acting with the habit of virtue, the virtue of religion, so to speak, We can prevent a dictator from coming by preventing the chaos that comes from a lack of virtue. If you lose that ability to be virtuous, you need a dictator just to survive. So I think that would be my takeaway.
Yeah. And it's what you were just saying there is very fascinating, because I think many people have this idea of freedom as being the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want. And what you just spoke to is that freedom demands virtue. Virtue and freedom go hand in hand. They are necessary for each other to exist, because without virtue, you have no freedom. And so that's something that's key. That is extremely important to every society, and especially American society, because we are built on this idea of freedom. And so in order to uphold that, we also have to uphold virtue.
Good place to stop.
Alrighty. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. We had a couple of other dictators that we wanted to talk to you about, but that's enough dictators for one day. We'll maybe sneak in some other dictators into another topic some other week. But in the meantime, thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining me. I'm Peter, and I have my brother right here.
I'm JP.
Thanks for joining the Pinedo Brothers. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, an artist podcast for Catholics. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. The Pinedo Brothers are Catholic filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art through film. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.